You probably saved for years just to afford this weekend, didn't you? Jennifer's voice cut across the Solara Bay Resort lobby, loud enough that the couple checking in at the next counter turned to stare. I stood there in my simple navy dress, the one I'd bought on sale at Macy's 3 years ago, feeling my face grow hot as my cousin looked me up and down with that familiar expression of thinly veiled contempt. My Honda Civic was still visible through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking painfully out of place among the Mercedes and BMWs lining the curved driveway, and I knew Jennifer had seen me pull up because she'd timed this moment perfectly, waiting until I reached the marble-floored lobby before making her entrance with Aunt Patricia beside her. The valet had taken my keys with barely concealed reluctance, his smile professional but cold. Nothing like the warm greeting he'd given the Tesla owner ahead of me, and the front desk clerk had processed my reservation with the kind of efficiency that suggested she was anxious to move on to more important guests. I'd worked as a social worker for 6 years now, helping families navigate the foster care system in downtown Seattle, and I made $52,000 a year, which wasn't nothing, but standing here surrounded by the kind of casual luxury that whispered of trust funds and corner offices, I felt exactly as small as Jennifer intended me to feel. The rooms here start at $600 a night, Aunt Patricia added, her tone suggesting she was being helpful, educational even, as if I might not have noticed the opulence surrounding us. We just want to make sure you're comfortable, Maya. This is quite a different environment than you're probably used to. Jennifer adjusted her Cartier bracelet, the one that had cost more than 3 months of my rent, and exchanged a look with her mother that I knew too well, that mixture of pity and superiority that had colored every family gathering since I'd moved in with them at 19. Jennifer worked as an investment banker in Manhattan, pulled in bonuses that could have fed the families on my caseload for a year, and she never let anyone forget it, least of all me. I'm fine, I managed to say, keeping my voice steady, even though my hands were shaking slightly as I gripped the handle of my practical rolling suitcase. I'm just here to celebrate your wedding. What I didn't say, what I'd never told anyone in my family, was that I owned a stake in this resort. Not just this specific property, but shares in Solara Resorts International worth approximately $2.3 million, part of a portfolio that had grown beyond anything I'd imagined possible 3 years ago when I'd made one quiet investment that changed everything. But standing there watching Jennifer smirk at my modest appearance, watching Aunt Patricia's eyes flick dismissively over my off-the-rack dress, I said nothing at all. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The pattern had started long before the Solara Bay Resort, years before Jennifer's engagement, stretching back to when I was 19 years old, and my mother's funeral reception had barely ended before Aunt Patricia sat me down to explain how things would work in her household. My father had died of a heart attack when I was 16, sudden and devastating, leaving my mother to raise me alone on a teacher's salary that barely covered our modest apartment in Sacramento. And then 3 years later, cancer took her too, aggressive and merciless. And suddenly, I was an orphan with 1 semester left of community college and nowhere to go except to my mother's sister in Portland. Aunt Patricia had agreed to take me in with the kind of martyred reluctance that made it clear I should be grateful. And from the first night in her sprawling house in the West Hills, I understood that I was not Jennifer's equal, but her charity case. The poor relation who slept in the converted office while Jennifer had the master bedroom suite. Jennifer was already at Yale then, studying economics, her tuition paid in full while I worked 30 hours a week at a campus bookstore to afford my classes at Portland State. And when we were both home for holidays, the contrast was made painfully clear in 1,000 small ways. Christmas 2015, I gave everyone thoughtful, handmade gifts, because that was what I could afford, and Jennifer gave her parents a weekend at a spa resort that cost more than my entire monthly budget, and Aunt Patricia spent dinner talking about how successful Jennifer was, how proud they were, while my gift sat unopened on the side table like an afterthought. When I graduated with my bachelor's degree in social work, paying my own way through 4 years of state school, Aunt Patricia came to the ceremony, but spent the lunch afterward lamenting that I hadn't pursued something more lucrative, that I was wasting my potential on a career that would never lead to financial security. And when Jennifer graduated from Yale a year later, they threw a party for 60 people and hired a caterer. I was excluded from Jennifer's graduation trip to Europe because it was a family vacation, and the cost per person was $8,000, which everyone knew I couldn't afford, and I spent that week alone in the house they'd already stopped thinking of as mine, working double shifts at the crisis center where I'd been hired. Every family dinner became a recitation of Jennifer's accomplishments, her analyst position at Goldman Sachs, her apartment in Manhattan, her salary that climbed year after year, while my work helping foster children navigate trauma was met with polite disinterest or thinly veiled disappointment. When I moved to Seattle for a better position 3 years ago, Aunt Patricia asked if I was sure I could afford living alone, as if I were still the grieving 19-year-old girl who'd needed her charity. And I'd said nothing about the $50,000 inheritance my mother had left in a separate account that Aunt Patricia knew nothing about. The money I'd already invested in a way that would change everything. The secret I'd kept because some part of me wanted to see how long they'd keep treating me as less than before I proved them wrong. The welcome dinner that first night took place in the resort's signature restaurant, Mareasa, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Pacific and the sunset painted everything gold and pink, and I arrived exactly on time wearing the one other nice dress I'd brought. A simple black sheath that had seemed elegant enough back in Seattle, but felt painfully plain surrounded by the designer clothes that draped every other woman at our table. I was seated at the far end, past Jennifer's college roommates and Brad's groomsmen, past even Brad's younger brother, who was only 16, and the message was clear in that seating arrangement, just as it had been clear in every family gathering for the past decade. Jennifer held court from the center position, her engagement ring catching the candlelight with every gesture, and within minutes of the appetizers arriving, she'd steered the conversation to her recent promotion to vice president at her firm, a position that came with a $400,000 base salary plus bonuses that she mentioned twice. "It's really about the work, though," she said with practiced humility that didn't quite hide her pride. "The compensation is just a reflection of the value you bring to clients." Aunt Patricia beamed at her from 2 seats down and added, "We've always known Jennifer would do remarkable things. Ever since she was young, she had this drive, this understanding of what it takes to succeed in the real world." The emphasis on real world felt deliberate, and I saw Aunt Patricia's eyes flick toward me for just a moment before she took a sip of her wine. Brad's father, a dermatologist from Connecticut, asked about the specifics of her position, and Jennifer launched into an explanation of mergers and acquisitions that had everyone nodding appreciatively. And then Brad, who I'd met only twice before, and who seemed kind in a passive sort of way, turned his attention down the table to me and asked, "Maya, Jennifer mentioned you work with foster children, is that right?" I felt a small surge of gratitude for the acknowledgement and started to explain my work with the county system, how I helped facilitate placements and coordinate services for families in crisis. But I'd barely gotten 3 sentences out before Jennifer cut in with a laugh that sounded affectionate, but carried an edge I recognized instantly. "Maya's always had such a soft heart," she said, and somehow she made it sound like a character flaw. "She wanted to save the world even when we were kids. It's admirable, really, even if it's not exactly practical." Aunt Patricia nodded and added, "We all have to choose our own paths. Some people prioritize financial stability and building a secure future, and others follow their passions regardless of the practical considerations." The word practical landed like a small slap, and I saw one of Jennifer's bridesmaids, a woman named Clarissa who worked at Morgan Stanley, exchange a glance with the woman beside her. Brad looked uncomfortable but said nothing, and the conversation moved on to wedding details, and I sat there pushing grilled salmon around my plate while laughter and champagne flowed around me. And when I excused myself before dessert, claiming exhaustion from travel, No one protested or asked me to stay, and I walked back to my modest room with its standard queen bed and garden view, fighting back tears that I refused to let fall until I'd closed the door behind me and finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of being treated like I didn't belong. I woke early the next morning determined to salvage something peaceful from this weekend, and by 8 o'clock I was at the resort's infinity pool that overlooked the ocean, wearing my navy one-piece swimsuit that was perfectly adequate but unmistakably practical compared to the designer bikinis I'd seen on other guests. And I'd chosen a lounge chair in the far corner where I could read and maybe feel invisible for a few hours. The book I'd brought was Evicted by Matthew Desmond, a deeply researched exploration of poverty and housing instability that related directly to my work. And I was 40 pages in, genuinely absorbed, when I heard Jennifer's laugh carrying across the pool deck like a warning bell. She arrived with her bridesmaids in a cloud of expensive perfume and entitlement, all of them wearing swimwear that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. And I watched from behind my sunglasses as they claimed the prime loungers near the pool bar, arranging themselves like they were posing for a magazine shoot. I tried to return to my book, tried to make myself smaller and less noticeable, but within 10 minutes Jennifer had spotted me, and I watched her say something to Clarissa that made them both look in my direction and laugh. Jennifer stood and walked over with her drink in hand, and the other bridesmaids followed like she was leading a parade. And suddenly, I was surrounded by women in Hermes bikinis, while I sat there in my Target one-piece, holding a book about eviction. "Oh, Maya, that's such a sensible suit," Jennifer said, and the word sensible dripped with condescension. "Very practical. Very you." The bridesmaids tittered, and I felt my face flush hot with humiliation. Jennifer leaned closer, peering at my book cover, and her expression shifted to something like theatrical concern. "God, that looks depressing," she announced loud enough for nearby guests to turn and look. "Poverty and eviction, Maya. You're on vacation at a luxury resort. Maybe try reading something less heavy?" I opened my mouth to respond, but she wasn't finished. She was on a roll now, playing to her audience. "Actually, you know what? If the resort scene isn't really your thing, there's a public beach about 2 miles down the road, very casual, very laid back. You might be more comfortable there." The implication hung in the air like smoke, and I felt something crack inside my chest, the careful composure I'd been maintaining since I arrived. Other guests were definitely staring now, and I was frozen in my chair, unable to speak or move. And then suddenly, there was movement beside me, and a young woman in the resort's crisp white uniform appeared holding a tall glass filled with something pink and tropical. "Ms. Chen, compliments of the resort," she said warmly, her name tag reading Sophia, and she set the smoothie on my side table with a smile that seemed to hold genuine kindness and something else, something knowing that I couldn't quite interpret. "Is there anything else I can bring you, Ms. Chen? We want to ensure your stay is perfect." The way she said it, the emphasis on your stay, the respect in her voice, it created a strange disconnect with the scene that had just unfolded, and Jennifer's expression flickered with confusion before settling back into smug satisfaction, and Sophia walked away, but not before giving me a look that seemed to say she understood more than she was letting on, and I was left holding my depressing book and my complimentary smoothie, while my cousin and her bridesmaids returned to their loungers, and I finally understood that this weekend was going to be even worse than I'd imagined. The bridesmaid dress fitting was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon at the resort's luxury boutique, an elegant space called Luminosa that occupied a corner of the main building with marble floors and champagne always chilling, and the kind of hushed atmosphere that made you feel poor just walking through the door. Jennifer had chosen the dresses weeks ago without consulting any of us, and when the sales associate brought them out on silk hangers, I felt my stomach drop, because even before I saw the price tag, I could tell they were expensive in that understated way that costs more than obvious logos ever could. They were beautiful, I had to admit that. A soft blush pink that would photograph gorgeously, floor length with delicate beading at the neckline. But when I carefully checked the tag while the other bridesmaids cooed over them, I saw the number 800 followed by two zeros, and I felt the familiar hot flush of panic that came with being out of my financial depth. I pulled Jennifer aside as the others were being ushered into fitting rooms, and I kept my voice quiet and tried to stay calm when I said, "Jennifer, I'm sorry, but $800 is really beyond what I budgeted for this. Is there maybe a less expensive option, or could I wear something I already own in a similar color?" Her expression transformed instantly from bridal excitement to cold fury, and her voice got loud, deliberately loud, when she said, "Are you serious right now, Maya? Are you actually trying to ruin my wedding over a dress?" The boutique went silent, and I could feel every eye in the space turn toward us, and I wanted to disappear into the marble floor. "You knew what kind of wedding this was going to be," Jennifer continued, her voice cutting through the quiet like glass breaking. "You knew this was going to be upscale. You knew we were doing this at Solara Bay, and now 2 days before my ceremony, you're telling me you can't afford to be in my wedding party?" I tried to explain that I wasn't saying I wouldn't do it, just asking if there were alternatives. But she was on a roll now, and Aunt Patricia had emerged from wherever she'd been browsing to stand beside her daughter with her arms crossed. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Aunt Patricia said, and her tone carried that particular condescension I'd heard my entire life. "Maya, this is about planning and priorities and fiscal responsibility. If you had saved appropriately instead of spending money on, I don't know what, you wouldn't be in this position." The other bridesmaids were frozen in various states of undress in the fitting room doorway, looking deeply uncomfortable, and I saw Clarissa exchange a glance with another bridesmaid that clearly communicated their shared mortification at this scene. Aunt Patricia opened her purse with a dramatic sigh and said, "I'll loan you the money. We can't have you showing up in something inappropriate. But Maya, we're going to need to have a serious conversation about financial planning and living within your means and understanding that actions have consequences." I agreed to the loan because what else could I do standing there with everyone watching and my cousin's wedding hanging in the balance, and I murmured my thanks while shame burned in my chest. And the sales associate processed Aunt Patricia's credit card with an expression I couldn't quite read. After we left, I saw through the boutique window that the manager, an elegant woman in her 50s, immediately picked up the phone, and something about her expression as she dialed made me wonder what conversation she was having. But I was too humiliated and exhausted to care about anything except getting back to my room and trying to remember why I'd thought coming to this wedding was something I could survive. The rehearsal dinner was held in the resort's grand ballroom, a soaring space with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the moonlit ocean. And I arrived at 7 o'clock wearing the nicest dress I'd brought, a simple black sheath that was appropriate but unremarkable, and I stood in the doorway for a moment looking for my table assignment among the elegantly arranged seating cards displayed on a gilt-edged board. I found my name, finally, after scanning past Jennifer's family table and the wedding party table and the tables clearly designated for Brad's relatives and important friends. And my card directed me to table 17 in the far back corner of the ballroom. And when I made my way there through the increasingly crowded room, I discovered I was seated with the wedding photographer, the videographer, two of Brad's distant cousins who looked barely out of college, and someone's elderly aunt who appeared confused about where she was. It wasn't with family. It wasn't even close to family. I was seated like an afterthought, like someone they'd been obligated to invite but didn't actually want present. And I stood there staring at my place card with my name written in beautiful calligraphy that somehow made the insult feel more deliberate. And I felt something shift in my chest, a weight settling that made it hard to breathe. I walked back through the ballroom to where Jennifer was holding court near the head table, surrounded by bridesmaids and looking radiant in a white rehearsal dinner dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. And I waited for a break in the conversation before I said quietly, "Jennifer, I think there might be a mistake with the seating. I'm at table 17 in the back." She turned to me with an expression of mild annoyance, like I was interrupting something important, and she said without any apparent embarrassment, "That's not a mistake, Maya. I needed to save the prime seating for important guests. You understand? It's nothing personal." The bridesmaids suddenly became very interested in their champagne glasses, and I saw Clarissa wince. Actually wince. And I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out because what could I possibly say that wouldn't create a scene at my cousin's rehearsal dinner? I returned to table 17 and sat through 3 hours of dinner and toasts and laughter that floated back from the front of the room where my family celebrated without me. And Brad's parents at table 3 kept glancing back at me with expressions that suggested they felt uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to say anything. And I picked at my salmon and made polite conversation with the photographer, who was kind enough to treat me like a real person. Halfway through dessert, a resort staff member in a crisp uniform approached my table and handed me a small envelope, cream-colored and heavy, and inside was a handwritten note on Solara Bay Resort letterhead that read, "Please come to the manager's office tomorrow at 10 a.m. Important matter. R. Thompson, GM." I read it 3 times, my heart beating faster with each reading, and I had no idea what the general manager could possibly want with me, but I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my purse, and for the first time that entire horrible evening, I felt something that might have been hope, though I couldn't have explained why. Back in my room that night, I sat on the edge of the bed with the general manager's note in my hand and let myself think about what my family didn't know, what I'd kept carefully hidden for 3 years now, because some part of me had been afraid that telling them would somehow make it less real or would give them power over something that was finally, completely mine. I remembered the day 3 years ago when I'd sat in the modest office of my mother's estate attorney and learned about the inheritance she'd left me, $50,000 that she'd saved and invested carefully over the years, money that Aunt Patricia knew nothing about because it had been in an account my mother had opened after my father died, something private and separate that she'd protected fiercely. The attorney had handed me the check and told me my mother's instructions were simply that I should use it wisely and in a way that would make me happy. And I'd sat there crying because it was so like her to think of my happiness even in death, to give me this gift that represented years of her sacrifice. I'd deposited the check, and for 2 weeks I'd simply let it sit in my bank account while I tried to figure out what wisely meant. Whether I should pay off my modest student loans, or put it toward a house down payment, or invest it conservatively in index funds the way financial advisors always recommended. Then I'd gotten a call from Priya Desai, my former roommate from state school, the brilliant computer science major who'd graduated summa cum laude and gone to work for a major tech company, but had always talked about wanting to build something meaningful, something that would actually help people instead of just optimizing advertising algorithms. She told me she was leaving her 6-figure job to start a company called Connect Care, software designed to coordinate social services for vulnerable populations, a platform that would let caseworkers and nonprofit organizations and government agencies communicate seamlessly to prevent people from falling through the cracks of disconnected systems. She was looking for initial investors, and she knew it was a long shot, and the first few years would be brutal, and she might fail completely. But she believed in the mission, and she wondered if I knew anyone who might be interested in taking a chance on her vision. I'd met her for coffee the next day and listened to her pitch and looked at her business plan, and I'd thought about my mother and about the clients I worked with every day who got lost in bureaucratic mazes, and about what wisely really meant. And I'd invested all $50,000 in Connect Care because I believed in Priya and I believed in the mission, and because making money while actually helping people seemed like the best possible use of my mother's gift. The company had grown slowly at first, then faster, then exponentially as municipalities and nonprofits recognized how desperately they needed exactly what Priya had built. 18 months after my investment, Connect Care secured a major contract with California's social services system. 6 months after that, they expanded to 4 more states. 2 years ago, the company went public, and my initial $50,000 investment became worth $8.7 million. A number so large I'd stared at my investment portfolio statement for 20 minutes, trying to understand that it was real. The morning of the wedding day, there was a casual brunch scheduled at 10:30 in the resort's oceanfront terrace restaurant, something intimate just for the bridal party and immediate family, and I'd slept poorly after sitting up late thinking about the general manager's mysterious note and what it could possibly mean. And I'd finally fallen asleep around 3 and woken at 9 feeling disoriented and anxious. I showered and dressed in white linen pants and a pale blue blouse, something casual and inoffensive, and I made my way down to the terrace at 10:15, because arriving early had always felt safer than walking into a room where everyone was already gathered. But when I approached the terrace entrance, I heard voices, familiar voices, and something in their tone made me stop just outside the doorway where I could hear but couldn't be seen, and I recognized Jennifer's laugh, that particular brittle quality it got when she was being cruel. I stood there with my hand on the doorframe and listened to my cousin say, "I almost didn't invite her, honestly, but Mom said it would look bad to exclude her completely, like we were being petty." Aunt Patricia's voice responded, warm with agreement in a way she'd never been warm with me. "She's always been the charity case, ever since we took her in, just like her father, absolutely no ambition, content to struggle." One of the bridesmaids, I couldn't tell which one, said something I couldn't quite hear, and then Jennifer again, louder, more animated. "Someone asked me yesterday why we treat her that way, like why am I so hard on Maya?" And I told them the truth, she needs to understand her place. This resort, this life, the kind of people who belong in places like this, it's all above her status, and the sooner she accepts that, the happier she'll be. The words hit me like physical blows, and I stepped back from the doorway, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. And I turned and walked quickly away from the terrace before anyone could see me, before I had to sit through brunch pretending I hadn't heard my own family discussing me, like I was a problem to be managed, an embarrassment to be tolerated. I made it to a quiet corridor near the lobby, before I had to stop and lean against the wall, shaking, and I looked at my watch and saw it was 9:45, and I remembered the note, the general manager, the 10 o'clock appointment, and I thought that at least I had somewhere to go that wasn't that terrace. At least I had a reason to not show up to brunch where they would smile at me and make small talk while thinking I was beneath them, while believing this resort and this life was above my status. I straightened my blouse and walked toward the administrative wing of the resort with my head up and my hands still trembling. And I had no idea what Robert Thompson wanted to discuss, but anything was better than sitting through another meal with people who spoke about me with such casual contempt when they thought I couldn't hear. The administrative wing was quieter than the rest of the resort, all elegant neutrals and hushed professionalism, and I found the general manager's office at the end of a carpeted hallway, the door slightly ajar with a brass nameplate that read, "Robert Thompson, General Manager," in understated letters. I knocked softly and heard a warm voice call, "Come in, Ms. Chen," and I pushed the door open to find a distinguished man in his mid-50s rising from behind a mahogany desk, his silver hair perfectly styled, his navy suit clearly expensive, his entire bearing radiating the kind of effortless authority that comes from years of managing luxury properties and handling the wealthy guests who frequented them. He came around the desk with his hand extended and a smile that seemed genuinely pleased to see me, not the professional courtesy smile I'd seen from other staff, but something more authentic. And he said, "Ms. Chen, thank you so much for coming. Please sit down. Can I offer you coffee or tea?" I sat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk and accepted the offer of tea, my hands still shaking slightly from the overheard conversation at brunch. And I watched him pour from an elegant silver service while I tried to imagine what this meeting could possibly be about. He handed me the cup and returned to his own chair and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between concern and professional assessment, and he said, "Ms. Chen, I want to begin by apologizing because I should have reached out to you the moment you checked in. But there was some confusion in our systems, and it wasn't until yesterday that my staff brought to my attention exactly who you are. I felt my stomach tighten with confusion, and I said carefully, I'm not sure I understand what you mean. And he smiled gently and said, Ms. Chen, I know that your investment portfolio includes significant shares in Solara Resorts International, the parent company that owns this property, and 17 other luxury resorts worldwide, which makes you not just a guest here, but one of our notable shareholders. Someone who should have been immediately recognized and offered every courtesy befitting that status. The words hung in the air, and I felt the room tilt slightly, felt the careful separation I'd maintained between my two lives suddenly collapsing, and Robert continued, his voice kind but firm. Corporate sent down explicit instructions when they learned you'd be staying with us this weekend, that we were to ensure your experience was absolutely perfect, that you were to receive every amenity and service we offer, and instead I've observed over the past 2 days that you've been treated with what I can only describe as casual neglect, seated poorly at dinner, placed in a standard room rather than a suite, and generally handled as though you were an afterthought rather than a valued shareholder. He paused and his expression shifted to something more personal, more concerned, and he said, I've also observed the dynamics between you and your family members, and I need to ask you directly, Ms. Chen, is everything acceptable with your stay? Because if there are issues, I need to know about them, and more importantly, if there are ways we can better serve you during what should be a joyful family occasion. It's my responsibility, and frankly, my pleasure to ensure that happens. I sat there looking at Robert Thompson and felt something shift inside me. The years of swallowing my hurt and accepting mistreatment suddenly pressing against my chest like something that needed to break free. And he was watching me with patient understanding, not rushing me. And finally I said quietly, it hasn't been acceptable, the way they've treated me here or anywhere else. But I've spent so long just trying to keep the peace, trying not to make waves, and I don't know if I want to cause problems at Jennifer's wedding. Robert leaned forward slightly, his expression gentle but serious, and he said, Ms. Chen, I'm not suggesting we cause problems. I'm suggesting we correct a situation that's already problematic. You are a shareholder in this company. You have certain privileges and standing that come with that position, including access to the owner's suite, which is valued at $15,000 per night, priority services, and the kind of treatment that reflects your actual status here, not the status your family has assigned to you. The words your actual status hit me hard because I realized I'd been living in two completely separate worlds for 3 years. The world where I was successful and financially secure and had made smart choices that paid off beyond my wildest dreams, and the world where I was still poor Maya, who needed to be tolerated and managed and kept in her place. And I'd let those worlds stay separate because some part of me had still been seeking my family's approval, still hoping that somehow they would see me and value me without me having to prove anything. But sitting there in that office with the morning sun streaming through the windows and the sound of the ocean beyond, and the memory of Jennifer's voice saying, this resort, this life, it's above her status, still echoing in my head, I felt something crystallize into clarity, and Robert seemed to sense the shift because he said quietly, Ms. Chen, people treat us how we teach them to treat us, and you've been teaching your family that it's acceptable to diminish you, but you have the power to teach them something different, not through cruelty or revenge, but simply by allowing yourself to be seen for who you actually are. I looked at him and felt tears burning behind my eyes, and I thought about my mother who had scrimped and saved to leave me that $50,000, who had believed in me even when Aunt Patricia didn't, who would have been so proud to know what I'd built from her gift, and I thought about the years of small humiliations and casual dismissals and being made to feel less than, and I made a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. I met Robert's eyes and asked, what options do I have? And he smiled, a genuine warm smile that held no judgment, only support, and he said, let me make some calls, Ms. Chen, and will ensure that the rest of your stay here reflects your true place in this resort and in this family. Not as their charity case, but as exactly who you are, successful, valued, and worthy of every courtesy we can extend. 2 hours later, I stood in the presidential owner's suite and barely recognized my surroundings or myself, and the transformation had happened so quickly, I still felt disoriented by the speed of it all, the efficiency of a luxury resort mobilizing to correct what they clearly viewed as an embarrassing oversight in how they'd treated one of their shareholders. Robert had made his calls, and within 20 minutes, a team of staff members had arrived at my modest standard room, professionally packing my belongings while explaining that I was being moved to accommodations more appropriate to my status, and I'd been escorted through the resort's private corridors to an elevator that required a special key card. Rising to the top floor, where the presidential suite occupied the entire east wing, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean, 3 bedrooms, a living area larger than my entire apartment back home, marble everywhere, and the kind of elegant luxury that I'd only seen in magazines. My belongings looked almost comically out of place in that space, my modest suitcase sitting on the plush carpet. But the staff had unpacked everything with the same care they would have given designer luggage, and then Sophia had appeared, no longer in the casual uniform I'd seen her wearing by the pool, but in the crisp, professional attire of management. And she'd smiled at my obvious surprise and said, "Ms. Chen, I'm actually the assistant manager here. I've been keeping an eye on your stay, and I want to personally apologize that it took us this long to recognize you properly and ensure you receive the treatment you deserve." She'd explained that the resort's premier styling service was being made available to me, complimentary for ownership stakeholders, and that we had 2 hours before the wedding ceremony, which was plenty of time. And before I could fully process what was happening, a team of stylists had arrived, transforming one of the suite's bedrooms into a temporary salon, and they'd worked with quiet professional efficiency while treating me with a deference I'd never experienced before. The hairstylist had gently taken down my simple ponytail and created something elegant and sophisticated, soft waves that framed my face and made me look polished and expensive. And the makeup artist had enhanced my features with subtle expertise, making my eyes look larger and more dramatic, my cheekbones more defined, the overall effect natural but unmistakably professional. And then the boutique manager had arrived personally with a selection of dresses from what she called their exclusive collection, pieces that hadn't been available during the bridesmaid shopping because they were reserved for VIP guests, and among them was an emerald green silk gown that fitted me perfectly, elegant and expensive, and exactly the kind of dress that commanded attention and respect. I'd stood in front of the full-length mirror in the suite's master bathroom and barely recognized the woman looking back at me because she looked powerful and confident and wealthy. She looked like someone who belonged in places like this. Someone who owned stakes in resort companies and made million-dollar investment decisions. And the disconnect between how I looked and how I felt inside was dizzying, because I was still Maya, who worked with struggling families and drove a Honda Civic and lived modestly. But I was also this woman in the mirror who had made choices that paid off beyond anything I'd imagined. And maybe it was time to stop hiding that part of myself, to stop making myself smaller to make other people comfortable. Sophia had returned to check on everything, and when she saw me, she'd smiled with genuine warmth and said, "Perfect, Ms. Chen. Absolutely perfect. You look like exactly who you are." And I'd felt tears threatening my carefully applied makeup, felt the weight of years of being made to feel less than suddenly lifting. And I'd looked at my reflection again and thought about Jennifer and Aunt Patricia and all the casual cruelties they'd inflicted because they'd believed I had no power, no status, no worth beyond what they assigned to me. And I felt terrified of what was about to happen, but also exhilarated, finally ready to let myself be seen. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock on the resort's private beachfront, and I left the presidential suite at 3:45, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and Sophia accompanied me down in the private elevator, her presence steadying me as we walked through the resort's elegant corridors toward the beach access where white chairs were arranged in perfect rows facing an arch decorated with white roses and flowing fabric that moved gently in the ocean breeze. Guests were still finding their seats, women in expensive dresses and men in tailored suits, everyone holding programs and chatting quietly, and I could see Jennifer near the front in her white gown, stunning and perfect as always, surrounded by her bridesmaids in their matching lavender dresses. The $800 dresses I'd needed Aunt Patricia's condescending loan to afford. And for just a moment, I felt the old instinct to make myself small, to slip quietly into my assigned seat in the back and not draw attention. But then I remembered Sophia's words. "You look like exactly who you are." And I straightened my shoulders and walked forward. Jennifer saw me before I reached the seating area, and her entire body went rigid, her eyes widening as she took in my appearance. The emerald silk gown that probably cost more than all the bridesmaids' dresses combined, my professionally styled hair and makeup, the way I was carrying myself, and I watched confusion flash across her face, followed quickly by something that looked like panic, and she broke away from her bridesmaids and intercepted me before I could reach the chairs, her voice a harsh whisper as she grabbed my arm and hissed, "Where did you get that dress?" I looked at her calmly, meeting her eyes with a steadiness I'd never managed before, and I smiled and said nothing, gently extracting my arm from her grip, and I could see her mind racing, trying to understand how her poor social worker cousin had suddenly transformed into someone who looked like she belonged at this wedding, more than most of the guests. I turned toward the back rows where I knew my seat was assigned, that humiliating position with the vendors and distant acquaintances. But before I could take more than 2 steps, Robert Thompson appeared at my side, distinguished in his dark suit. And he said clearly, his voice carrying in the pre-ceremony quiet, "Ms. Chen, please allow me to escort you to your proper seat." And he offered his arm with the kind of formal courtesy usually reserved for the mother of the bride, and I took it, feeling every eye on the beach turn toward us. He walked me past the back rows, past the middle section, all the way to the front row on the bride's side, the family section where Aunt Patricia was already seated next to Jennifer's grandmother, and Aunt Patricia's face went from confused to shocked to angry in rapid succession, and she actually started to stand, saying loudly, "There's been a mistake. That seat is for—" But Robert interrupted her smoothly, his voice professional and firm and absolutely unyielding. "No mistake, Mrs. Chen. Ms. Maya Chen is seated exactly where she should be, in the family section befitting her status." And he waited until I was settled in the plush white chair before nodding respectfully and stepping away. And I could feel the whispers rippling through the guests like wind through grass, could see heads turning and people leaning together to murmur questions, could see Jennifer's face reddening with barely contained fury, even as the string quartet began playing, and she had no choice but to return to her position because the ceremony was beginning and she couldn't make a scene now, not in front of 200 guests, not at her own wedding. The ceremony passed in a blur of traditional vows and readings that I barely registered because I was too aware of Jennifer's rigid posture at the altar, the way her eyes kept darting toward me during the processional, as if she couldn't quite believe I was still sitting in the front row, and Aunt Patricia beside me radiated fury in waves, her body angled slightly away from me, her jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping, but she couldn't make a scene during the ceremony, any more than Jennifer could. And so we all sat through the exchange of rings and the pronouncement of marriage and the kiss that sealed it. And then the recessional where Jennifer walked past me on Brad's arm with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And the ceremony concluded, and guests began moving toward the grand ballroom where the reception was being held. And I felt the weight of curious stares following me, heard the whispered conversations that cut off when I came near, because clearly word had spread that something unusual was happening, that the bride's poor cousin had somehow received treatment normally reserved for dignitaries or celebrities, and people were speculating and wondering and probably spinning theories that ranged from plausible to absurd. The grand ballroom had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, All white flowers and crystal and soft golden lighting, round tables with silk linens arranged around a dance floor, and a head table on a raised platform where the wedding party would sit. And I assumed I'd be directed to some table in the back with other miscellaneous guests. But Sophia appeared at my elbow and guided me directly to the head table, to a seat that had clearly been added recently, because the spacing was slightly different from the original arrangement, and I was placed between one of Brad's groomsmen and Jennifer's grandmother. And when Jennifer saw this, her face went from flushed to nearly purple. But guests were watching, and photographers were positioning people, and she couldn't object without creating exactly the kind of scene that would ruin her perfect wedding narrative. Dinner service began, and I noticed immediately how differently the staff treated me compared to the past 2 days, how the servers made sure my wine glass was never empty, how the sommelier personally described each course to me with the kind of attention usually reserved for the bride and groom, how Robert Thompson himself stopped by the head table to ensure everything was to my satisfaction, and other guests definitely noticed. I could see them leaning together and whispering, trying to figure out who I was and why I warranted such treatment. And Aunt Patricia noticed too, because halfway through the main course, she leaned across Jennifer's grandmother and hissed at me, her voice low and venomous. "What did you do, Maya? What lies did you tell them to get this treatment, because I know you can't afford to pay for it?" I looked at her calmly and said nothing, just returned my attention to my plate, and my silence seemed to enrage her more than any response could have. And I could feel Jennifer's anger building through dinner like a storm gathering strength, the way she kept glancing at me, the tight smile she maintained for guests and photographers while her eyes stayed cold and furious. And I knew something was coming, knew that Jennifer had never been able to let a perceived slight go unanswered, and after the toasts were completed and the cake was cut, and the first dance concluded, Jennifer took the microphone from the DJ and her voice rang out across the ballroom, bright and sharp. "I'd like to take a moment to address something that's been bothering me today." And my stomach dropped because I just knew, and she continued, "I'd like to know how my cousin Maya suddenly became so important here at this resort. Maya, did you sleep with the manager? Is that how you bought that dress you're wearing?" The ballroom went utterly silent, 200 guests frozen in shock, and I heard gasps and saw Brad's face go white with horror, and Jennifer stood there with the microphone, her smile vicious, finally having said what she'd been wanting to say all evening, and I felt every eye in the room turn to me, waiting, judging, and my hands were shaking, but I stood up, my legs somehow steady despite the fear coursing through me, and I faced Jennifer and the room full of strangers and family, and I knew this was the moment that would define everything that came after. I stood there facing Jennifer and 200 guests in that crystal-draped ballroom, my hands shaking but my voice steady as I said clearly enough for everyone to hear, "I didn't sleep with anyone, Jennifer. I'm treated well here because 3 years ago I invested money that Mom left me in a tech startup, a company called Connect Care that creates coordination software for social services, and that company went public 2 years ago, and my initial $50,000 investment became worth $8.7 million. And part of my current portfolio includes significant shares in Solara Resorts International, which owns this resort, and 14 others across the country. So I'm not just a guest here, Jennifer, I'm a part owner." And the silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the ocean through the open ballroom doors, could hear someone's champagne glass clink against their plate, and I watched Jennifer's face cycle through expressions too quickly to name, confusion and disbelief and dawning horror. And Aunt Patricia stood up so fast, her chair scraped loudly against the floor, and she said, her voice shrill with shock, "That's impossible. You're a social worker. You live in that tiny apartment. You drive a Honda. You couldn't possibly have that kind of money." And I turned to face her, my aunt who'd spent 12 years making me feel small. And I said calmly, "I am a social worker, Aunt Patricia, because I love the work, because I believe in helping people, because making a difference in someone's life matters more to me than a luxury car or a big house. But I'm also a successful investor. I've been both things for 3 years. I've had money and success and independence while you've treated me like your charity case, while you've made me feel like I should be grateful for your condescension. While Jennifer has spent years telling me that places like this resort are above my status. And I looked back at Jennifer, who was still holding the microphone limply, her perfect wedding smile completely gone, and I said, my voice softer now but carrying in the silent room, I've been both things, successful and modest, wealthy and dedicated to service, and I never told you because I didn't need you to know. I didn't need your approval or your validation, but I also didn't expect to be publicly accused of prostitution at your wedding, so here we are. Brad had moved to Jennifer's side and gently took the microphone from her hand, his face a mixture of embarrassment and what looked like respect, as he glanced at me, and I could see some of the guests nodding slightly, could see the shift in how they were looking at me. No longer confused or judgmental but impressed and perhaps sympathetic, because Jennifer's cruelty had been on full display and my response had been measured and dignified and supported by facts that anyone could verify, and Jennifer seemed to realize this because she said quickly, her voice artificially bright, "Maya, I was joking, obviously. Just wedding stress, you know I didn't mean." But I interrupted her, my voice still calm, but with an edge of steel I'd never used with her before. You weren't joking, Jennifer. You've never been joking. Not when you suggested I'd be more comfortable at the public beach. Not when you seated me with vendors at the rehearsal dinner. Not when you've spent years making sure I knew exactly how little you thought of me, and I accepted it because I wanted family. Because after Mom died, you and Aunt Patricia were all I had left. But I'm done accepting mistreatment. I'm done making myself small so you can feel big. The ballroom remained silent, every guest transfixed by the confrontation unfolding at what should have been a celebration, and I knew this moment would be remembered long after the flowers wilted and the cake was eaten, knew that I'd finally spoken a truth that couldn't be taken back, and I felt simultaneously terrified and free. The aftermath of my words rippled through the ballroom like a stone thrown into still water, and I watched Jennifer's face cycle through emotions as she tried to find solid ground in a situation that had completely escaped her control, and she attempted a laugh that came out brittle and false, saying to the room at large, "Well, Maya's always had a flair for the dramatic. I was obviously joking earlier, just wedding stress and too much champagne. We all know family teasing can go too far." But her voice lacked conviction, and the guests weren't buying it because they'd heard the venom in her accusation and witnessed my calm, factual response, and Aunt Patricia recovered more quickly, her survival instincts sharper after years of social maneuvering, and she moved toward me with her arms outstretched as if for an embrace, saying loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "Maya, darling, I always knew you had it in you. I always believed you'd be successful. Remember how I encouraged your education, how I supported your choices?" And I stepped back from her reaching arms and said quietly but firmly, "No, Aunt Patricia, you didn't. You told me I was wasting my potential. You compared me unfavorably to Jennifer at every opportunity. You made me feel like accepting your guardianship meant accepting a permanent position as the family disappointment, and I won't let you rewrite history now that rewriting it serves your purposes." And her arms dropped and her face hardened into something cold and calculating, the mask slipping to reveal what had always been underneath. I turned to address the room because I owed these witnesses some kind of closure to the scene they'd been subjected to, and I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through me, "I apologize that you all had to witness this family conflict at what should be a celebration. I hope the rest of your evening is enjoyable." And then I looked at Jennifer and Brad and said more quietly, "I wish you both happiness. I genuinely do. But I'm done accepting mistreatment from people who are supposed to care about me. I wanted family, but not at the cost of my dignity, not at the price of making myself small so others can feel big." And Jennifer opened her mouth to respond, but I continued, "You have a choice, Jennifer. We can try to build a genuine relationship based on mutual respect, where you see me as an equal instead of a charity case, or we can maintain polite distance at necessary family functions, but either way, I won't accept being treated as less than I am." And I turned to Aunt Patricia and said, my voice harder now, "You were my guardian after Mom died. You provided housing and food, and I'm grateful for that. But you were never my mother. You never treated me with a mother's love. And you don't get to claim credit for my success or suddenly pretend you believed in me when we both know that's a lie." The ballroom felt suffocating suddenly. Too many eyes and too much emotion, and the weight of years of silence finally broken. And I needed air and space and the sound of something other than whispers and shocked silence. So I walked toward the open doors that led to the beach, my borrowed designer dress whispering against my legs. And I heard Brad say something to Jennifer in a low, urgent voice, and Jennifer's response that sounded like a sob. But I kept walking because I'd said what needed saying, and staying would only invite more confrontation or forced reconciliation that neither of us was ready for. And I stepped out onto the terrace and then down the stairs to the sand, slipping off my heels because walking in them on the beach was impossible. And the ocean sound filled my ears and the cool night air filled my lungs. And I walked along the water's edge feeling simultaneously lighter and more exhausted than I'd ever felt in my life. I'd been walking for perhaps 10 minutes when I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Robert Thompson approaching, still in his impeccable suit despite the late hour and the beach setting. And he stopped a respectful distance away and said, "That took remarkable courage, Ms. Chen. I hope you're all right." And I surprised myself by laughing, a genuine sound that wasn't bitter or angry, but simply honest, and I said, "I don't know if I'm all right, but I'm free. Does that make sense?" And he smiled and nodded and said, "Perfect sense. And I want you to know that you're welcome at any Solara property anytime, as our guest or our owner, or simply as someone who deserves respect and excellent service. And if you ever need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out." And his kindness after years of casual family cruelty nearly undid me, and I felt tears finally spill over and said, "Thank you for treating me like I mattered before you knew about the money. Sophia, too. That kindness meant more than you know." And he nodded and tactfully looked out at the ocean while I composed myself. And after a moment he said, "For what it's worth, the social work you do matters. The money is just money. But the work is who you are, and that's worth considerably more." And then he walked back toward the resort, leaving me alone with the waves and the stars and the liberating, my terrifying realization that I'd finally chosen my own worth over their approval. 6 months later, I was still working at the same community center in San Francisco, still driving my Honda, still living in my modest apartment because these things represented my choices and my values, and I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. But I'd also accepted a position on Connect Care's board of directors where I could help guide the company's mission and ensure we stayed focused on actually helping people rather than just generating profit. And I'd cut contact with Aunt Patricia entirely after she'd sent a series of emails that alternated between guilt-tripping and asking for loans. And Jennifer and I had exchanged several long, difficult phone conversations that were slowly, tentatively building towards something that might eventually resemble a genuine relationship between equals, though we weren't there yet and might never be. And I'd started dating a teacher I met through work, who knew about the money but didn't care about it and loved that I was more excited about a successful client outcome than a stock portfolio increase. And on difficult days when I doubted my choices, I remembered standing in that ballroom finally speaking my truth, remembered the weight lifting from my shoulders as I walked away from people who'd never valued me. And I knew with absolute certainty that I'd made the right choice, that my worth had never depended on their recognition, and that freedom and self-respect mattered more than any family connection built on a foundation of dismissal and conditional acceptance.